Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Let us move to the next chapter in the Nikah, and this is the ruling on al-azl, or how they say in English, coitus interruptus. Let's take one of these ahadith of the chapter from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. He says, we attained some prisoners of war and we would practice coitus interruptus with them, and we asked the Prophet about this. The Prophet asked, Innakum lataf'alun, you do this? He asked this 3 times, and then afterwards he said, ما من نسمة كائنة إلى يوم القيامة إلا هي كائنة. There is no soul which is to be born up till Yawm al-Qiyamah except that it will be born, no matter what. And in other wordings of the chapter, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا عليكم ألا تفعلوا فإنما هو القدر. It does not matter if you do not do it, for it is qadr, meaning the creation of the child is qadr. We find from these narrations that the Prophet ﷺ did not make it haram. You do not need the consent of the servant girl, but if you are married to a free woman, then you do need her consent, because you could be preventing birth, and the birth or having a child is her right, and you cannot take her right away from her. There are some scholars who would interpret the words of the Prophet as La alaykum alla taf'alu, meaning no. In other words, you should not do this. And alaykum alla taf'alu, it is upon you not to do it. So upon this then it would be a prohibition. But what is apparent from the hadith is that this is one sentence. So it is to say that there is no sin upon you if you do not do the azl. Another narration in the chapter, statement of Jabir ibn Abdullah, he says, we used to make azl during the time when the Quran was being revealed. That's a statement. And one of the narrators adds an addition here. He says, and if it had been something prohibited, the Quran would have mentioned it. So clearly this narration tells us that the azl was permitted, and hence still is permitted. In another narration, the Prophet stated verbally and directly that it is permissible to make azl, where Jabir reports that a man came to the Prophet and he says that he wants to have intercourse with his servant girl, but does not want her to become pregnant. And the Prophet specifically said, "I'azil anha in shit, فَإِنَّهُ سَيَأْتِيهَا مَا قُدِّرَ لَهَا." You can make azl if you want to, but whatever is decreed for her will come to her. And so after a while, the man came back and said that this servant girl has become pregnant. And the Prophet told him, قَدْ أَخْبَرْتُكَ أَنَّهُ سَيَأْتِيهَا مَا قُدِّرَ لَهَا. I informed you already that whatever is decreed for her will come to her. Here's a question pertaining to the free wife. If the man is sterile, so that he is not able to produce the reproductive fluid, can she ask for a nullification of the marriage? The answer is yes, because this is an aib, a defect, and you can ask for a nullification of the marriage because of a defect. We can also take from the statement of Jabir, which we just mentioned, about their making azl and the Quran being revealed. We may take that if the Prophet did not know about something, then Allah Jalla wa Ala certainly did, and He would have informed the people of it if the Prophet did not know. So as for the azl, we say even if it is permitted, it is contrary to what is better. What is better is to have many children. The Prophet ﷺ told us, تَزَوَّجُوا الْوَدُودَ الْوَلُودَ, marry the woman who is loving and fertile. فَإِنِّي مُكَاثِرٌ بِكُمْ الْأَنْبِيَاءَ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ, because I will compete with the other prophets using you, my ummah, as to who has the most followers. In modern times, wearing contraceptive gear so that it collects the reproductive fluid of the male would be more effective than azl. So that is permissible. But again, we say this would be the thing to do if, let's say, the woman is weak and cannot bear getting pregnant, or they want to space out the children that they have, because pregnancy is a tough period to go through. So with these reasons, it is fine. But other than that, it is contrary to that which is preferred. What about the situation where if a married couple have, let's say, 3 or 4 children, they say this is enough, we do not want any more. And so now we're going to prevent pregnancy. We say in response to this that this type of thinking is a complete mistake. First and foremost because, like we said before, it goes against that which is better. The Prophet ﷺ wants us to have many children, not to limit the number of children. So this is from the textual evidence, as you have heard. And then secondly, just from a rational point of view, if you have 3 or 4 children, who told you that is enough? It may be the case that you limit the children that you have. Your wife becomes, let's say, 45 years of age, and it becomes very difficult to become pregnant at that age. Not impossible, but certainly very difficult. Let us say these 4 children of yours die all at once. What are you left with? Well, you're left with no children. Could you have more children? Not really. Your wife is 45 years old. She's past it. And that will lead to regret. Let's move to the next chapter, that it is haram to have intercourse with a pregnant servant girl. This hadith from Abu Darda, it says the Prophet ﷺ came upon a woman in her advanced stages of pregnancy at the door of a tent. The Prophet said, لَعَلَّهُ يُرِيدُ أَن يُلِمَّ بِهَا. Perhaps the man accompanying this woman intends to cohabit with her. They said yes, to which the Prophet replied, لَقَدْ هَمَمْتُ أَنْ أَلَعْنَهُ لَعْنًا يَدْخُلُ مَعَهُ قَبْرَهُ كَيْفَ يُوَرِّثُهُ وَهُوَ لَا يَحِلُّ لَهُ كَيْفَ يَسْتَخْدِمُهُ وَهُوَ لَا يَحِلُّ لَهُ. I have intended to curse him with a curse that would enter with him in his grave. How can he make the child inherit him when it is not halal for him? How can he use the child as a servant when it is not halal for him? Okay, so the scenario of the hadith is that, let us suppose the Muslims have gone to war and they've won the war and they have captured some females. These will be the servants for the Muslims. The Muslim is allowed to have intercourse with such a servant. But supposing that this female servant is already pregnant from her previous husband, let's say, the rule is it is haram for this Muslim man to have intercourse with her until she delivers her load or until she undergoes 1 menstrual cycle. That is to ensure that her womb is empty, because normally pregnant women do not menstruate. The Prophet says, how can he make him inherit him when it is not halal for him? In the early stages of pregnancy, if he has intercourse with her, then we would not know whether the child born is with the Muslim man or the previous man. So that would be her non-Muslim husband, let's say, if she's a prisoner of war from the kuffar. Whose child is it? We would not be sure. And this is certainly the case in the early stages of pregnancy. If we then suppose that this child is the Muslim man's child, and therefore he will inherit the father, as of course he do, but the actuality is that he is not his child, because let us suppose that in reality he is the first man's child. So what's happening here is that this child will be inheriting the Muslim man when it is not halal for him to do so, when the Muslim man is not the father. This is what the Prophet means when he says, how can he make him inherit him when it's not halal for him? And then he also says, how can he make this child his servant when it is not halal for him? And this is the case whereby the Muslim man who has taken this captive thinks that this child belongs to the first man, the non-Muslim man. If it belongs to the first man, then the Muslim man does have the right to use this child as a servant. But if this child belongs to him, then this child is a free child, because this Muslim man is a free man, and therefore he does not have the right to use him as a servant. So supposing this man thinks that this child belongs to the first man, the non-Muslim man, whereas in reality it belongs to him, so he's using a free person as a servant. And of course, that is not a trivial mistake. So either way, you can see from the hadith, you risk a major mistake if you have intercourse with a pregnant captive of war. One might say, well, what about in the later stages when you can be sure who the father is? Even in the later stages, it is not halal, because the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يحل لرجل أن يسقي زرع غيره. It is not halal for a man to water other than his crops. So that is to say, have intercourse with a woman who is pregnant with not his child, another man's child. So he makes the analogy there that you're watering somebody else's crops. You're not allowed to do that. We can also take from the hadith the intense care that the Prophet had to get your lineage right. Children must not be mixed up. And it is for this reason we are strict against zina and adultery. Let us now move to the next chapter, which is about al-ghila and the disapproval of al-azl, coitus interruptus. Let us take this hadith from Judamata bint Wahab, the sister of Urkasha. She said, I was present with the Prophet with some other people, and the Prophet said, لَقَدْ هَمَمْتُ أَنْ أَنْهَى عَنِ الْغِيلَةِ فَنَظَرْتُ فِي الرُّومِ وَفَارِسِ فَإِذَا هُمْ يَغِيلُونَ أَوْلَادَهُمْ فَلَا يَضُرُّ أَوْلَادَهُمْ ذَلِكَ شَيْئًا. I seriously intended to prevent ghila, But then I looked to the Rum and the Faris, and they were doing it, and it did not harm their children. And then the Prophet was asked about al-azl, coitus interruptus, and the Prophet said, ذَلِكَ الْوَأْدُ الْخَفِي. This is the secret burying alive of the children. And one of the narrators added the ayah of the Quran, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ. And when the daughter who was buried alive will be asked or questioned. Now, the first question is, what is ghila? Ghila is to have sexual intercourse with a woman who is breastfeeding a child. Why would that be thought to be dangerous? Well, if you have intercourse and she becomes pregnant thereby, then her nourishment of the body will go towards the child she has conceived. But at the same time, her nourishment also needs to be given to the breastfeeding child. So it's like from one source, the mother, you have two people draining her nourishment resources. One is the breastfeeding child, and the other one is the newly conceived child. And so this is what the Prophet ﷺ was worried about. But then he says he looked to the Rum and Faris, who are the other two nations, and they used to do that and it would not harm their children. So the Prophet then decided that there is nothing wrong with ghila. So from this hadith we can take that the Prophet could give rulings, that is to say shar'i rulings, based on his ijtihad. Because the point is, if it was a matter sent down by Allah Jalla wa'ala, who ordered the Prophet to prohibit ghila, then the Prophet would have to prohibit ghila. But what prevented the Prophet from prohibiting ghila is nothing to do with what Allah Jalla wa'ala sent down, but rather, as he says himself, he looked into the other nations of Rum and Faris, and that was evidence enough that ghila is not harmful. So the point is that the Prophet can make rulings through his ijtihad. Another example is the authentic hadith, لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك عند كل صلاة. If it wasn't for the fact that I would cause hardship on my ummah, I would order them to make siwak for every salah. So what prevented the Prophet from ordering the ummah is that he would cause hardship. However, this was from his own ijtihad that he wanted to order the ummah to make siwak with every salah, because if it had been an order from Allah Jalla wa'ala, then the Prophet would not be allowed to change that order. But you see clearly here the Prophet is making ijtihad. We may also take that lessons can be learned from the kuffar if it is not pertaining to the deen. So this idea of ghila is not pertaining to an act of ibadah in which we would be imitating the kuffar. No, rather this is just one of these everyday matters in which there is no problem in learning or taking lessons from the kuffar. And the Prophet was asked about al-azl, and he called it al-wa'd al-khafi, the secret burial. This is because, as you know, the habit of the Arab in those times, in the Jahiliyyah times, was to bury the daughter alive, because they did not want to have daughters. They wanted to have sons, because sons can defend and protect the tribe. Now this is the secret burial, the azl, because when you physically bury your daughter, then you're performing a physical action, which is the burial, and you have your intention as well, which is to do away with the child. With the azl, you are not physically burying anyone alive, and you're not killing anyone physically, that is obvious. So the first ingredient is missing, but the second ingredient is present, which is that you do not want this child. So that's why the Prophet said that this is the secret burying, on the basis that the intention or the qasd is the same, that you do not want this child. We have authentically a narration in Sunan Abi Dawud which is worth pointing out here, that one of the Sahabi said that he wanted to make azl with his servant girl, but the Yahud say that the azl is the smaller burial. To which the Prophet replied, كَذَبَتِ الْيَهُودِ, the Yahud have not spoken correctly. إِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ أَن يَخْلُقَهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتَ أَن تَصْرِفَهُ. If Allah wants to create the child, you would not be able to avert it. From this hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud and others, one might think that this contradicts with the hadith which we have just read. And the way to reconcile it, because on the surface it does seem like a contradiction, so the way to reconcile it is to say that in this particular hadith in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet is likening the intention of the two actions, because the intention is the same, which is to do away with the child. As for what the Yahud said in the other hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud and others, they said that the azl is the al-maw'udatu sughra, the small daughter who was buried alive. So it's the smaller burial. What the Yahud meant there was that azl would definitely prevent the conception. And the Prophet is saying here, no, it will not definitely prevent the conception, because if Allah Jalla wa Ala wants the conception, it will happen even if you make al-azl. And what supports this is the hadith just in the previous chapter, where a companion asked that he wants to have intercourse with his servant girl, but he does not want to conceive, and the Prophet said, "i'zil anha in shit, make azl from her if you want to, فَإِنَّهُ سَيَأْتِيهَا مَا قُدِّرَ لَهَا, because whatever is decreed for her will come to her." And then this man, after a while, came back to the Prophet and he said that the woman has conceived. And then the Prophet said, قَدْ أَخْبَرْتُ لَكَ أَنَّهُ سَيَأْتِيهَا مَا قُدِّرَ لَهَا. I had already informed you that whatever is going to come to her will come to her. So whatever is decreed for her will come to her. So like this we may reconcile these two ahadith, which seem to be contradictory on the surface. Let us move to the next book, which is the Getawa, the book of breastfeeding. Let's take this hadith from Aisha radiallahu anha. She was with the Prophet and she heard the voice of a man seeking permission to enter the house of Hafsa. Aisha asked the Prophet that there is a man seeking permission to enter your house. The Prophet said, I think he is such and such a person, the uncle of Hafsa, by breastfeeding. Aisha asked, O Messenger of Allah, if her uncle by breastfeeding was alive, could he enter my house? The Prophet said, Na'am, inna al-rada'ata tuharrimu ma tuharrimu al-wiladah. Yes, breastfeeding makes haram what birth makes haram. And in another narration, the Prophet said, يَحْرُمُ مِنَ الرَّضَاعَةِ مَا يَحْرُمُ مِنَ الْوِلَادَةِ. Whatever is haram through birth relations is also haram through breastfeeding relations. Now, your biological mother could breastfeed you, and this is what normally happens. However, another woman can also breastfeed you, another woman who is not your biological mother. Now, this type of breastfeeding, under conditions, does produce a family type of kinship. It's not the same as family kinship, that is blood ties, it's not the same as that, but it is similar in some respects. So it is similar with respects to the mahramiyah, that a man and a woman are mahram to each other, cannot be married to each other forever, and hence she does not need to observe hijab in front of him, and they can be in privacy together, they can travel together as well. It's as if the male is the brother to the female, or for example, it's as if the male is the uncle to the female. Of course, these are mahramiyah type of relationship. Where they differ are normally financial matters, so there's no inheritance that runs between them. And there is no giving blood money on account of someone else that runs between them. And there is no nafaqah, daily expenditure that runs between them. And also there is no silatul rahim, joining ties of kinship that runs between them. Whereas all of that does run in the blood relations. We find in Surah An-Nisa, from the types of women haram to marry are the ummahatukum allati arda'anakum wa akhawatukum min ar-rada'ah, your mothers who breastfed you and your sisters from breastfeeding. So if a woman breastfeeds you, who is a male, and another female who is not your blood sister, then actually that female becomes as if she was your blood sister, and you are not allowed to marry her forever. She does not need to observe hijab in front of you. You can be in privacy with each other, you can travel with each other. So if a woman breastfeeds you and she's not your biological mother, then her daughters, and we are assuming you're a male here, her daughters would be like your sisters. Her sisters would be like your maternal aunts. Her mother would be like your grandmother. Her husband would be like your father. And her husband's sisters would be like your paternal aunts. All of these are maharim, of course. Also, her daughter's daughter would be like your niece. And also her son's daughter would also be like your niece. Again, mahram relationship. And when we say her husband, meaning a breastfeeding mother's husband, we mean her husband at the time when she was breastfeeding you, not before or after. This husband we call sahibul laban, the owner of the milk. And the reason for that is when this man has intercourse with this woman, his wife, and she becomes pregnant, she would produce milk because of this pregnancy. So this milk is produced due to his intercourse with her, which makes him the owner of the milk, or the sahibul laban. If this man is not the sahibul laban,
then the mahramiyya does not apply to him.
Okay, up to now it's all relatively uncontroversial. The dispute comes in when we talk about matters of the sihr, or the relations through the marriage contract. If you are a male, there are 4 types of women you are never allowed to marry due to marital relations, and these are women that your father has married. We're talking about your blood father here. Also, women that your son has married, again your biological son. Also, your wife's mother you are never allowed to marry. And lastly, which is 4thly, your wife's daughter. Of course, we're assuming here that this is your wife's daughter from another man, because if it's your wife's daughter from your own self, then that would be your own daughter, and that's obvious that you're not allowed to marry your own daughter because of the blood relations. Okay, so these are the 4 types of women you as a male are not allowed to marry through the sihr, through the marital relations. Now comes the interesting question. Do these 4 types of women apply through the, not blood relations now, but through the breastfeeding relations? So for example, are you allowed to marry your wife's mother through breastfeeding? In other words, another woman breastfed your wife. So she's not your wife's biological mother, but she's the mother through breastfeeding. Are you allowed to marry her? Also, if your father through breastfeeding, that is, the man married to the woman who breastfed you, if this man had married another woman previously, are you allowed to marry that woman? And 4thly, if you have a son through breastfeeding, that is, your wife breastfed a male child, and this male child now grows up and marries another woman, and then he divorces her, are you allowed to marry that woman whom he has divorced? Well, if he was your blood son, then the ayah in the Quran is very clear. وَحَلَائِلُ أَبْنَائِكُمُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ أَصْلَابِكُمْ. And the wives of the sons from your own loin, meaning your blood sons, you are not allowed to marry them ever. But does it apply through breastfeeding relations? This is the question.
Similarly, if your wife has a previous breastfeeding daughter, so that you are not the sahibul laban, then are you allowed to marry such a woman? That is, the daughter of this wife of yours. Because if this daughter of your wife was a biological daughter, then the ayah of the Quran is clear that you are not allowed to marry this Rabiba, who is the daughter of your wife. Biologically, the matter is clear-cut. But what about breastfeeding relations though?
So the 4 types of women whom you are not allowed to marry through the sihr, does it also apply through breastfeeding relations? This is the question. Most scholars say yes, it does. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah says no, it doesn't. And the funny thing here is that both parties use the same evidence, which is the hadith you just heard. The majority say that if these women are haram to you from sihr, then they're also haram to you if they're related to you via breastfeeding relation as well. The other party says that the Prophet said in the hadith, إِنَّ الرَّضَاعَ تُحَرِّمُ مَا تُحَرِّمُ الْوِلَادَةِ. So he links between the rada'a, breastfeeding, and the wilada, the birth, that is the blood relations. He does not make any mention of the sihr, of the marital relations. That is, people related to you by way of a marital or nikah contract. So that is to say, why is the mother of your wife haram for you to marry forever? Well, you clearly do not have any blood relations between you two. The blood relation is only between your wife and her mother. So the reason why your wife's mother is haram for you to marry is because of the sihr. But this is your wife's blood mother. It is not your wife's breastfeeding mother. So when it comes to those women haram through the sihr, it must be sihr and the nasab, that is the blood relations. As for sihr with the rada'a, then this is halal according to Ibn Taymiyyah. What further supports this, he says, is the statement of Allah, وَحَلَائِلُ أَبْنَائِكُمُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ أَصْلَابِكُمْ. And the wives of your sons. Which sons are these? Your sons from your aslab, from your own loins, that is, your blood sons. So this would be not your sons from breastfeeding. Someone may argue back and say, no, the only reason why the Quran says min aslabikum, from your loins, is to prevent anyone from thinking that it also could include your sons from at-tabanni, which is adoption. But that would not be a good objection, because your sons from adoption are not your sons aslan. So if that's the case, the only other son that you could have would be from breastfeeding. So if we go along with this opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah, we would say that the breastfeeding mother of your wife is halal for you to marry. Likewise, the daughter of your wife through breastfeeding is halal for you to marry. And when we say that, just be careful here. The scenario would be that there is a woman who breastfed a girl. And then thereafter, keyword thereafter, you married this woman who breastfed the girl. And then this girl grew older and you married this girl. This would be halal. Of course, if you're married to a woman and she breastfeeds another girl, then this girl would be your breastfeeding daughter, and of course you're not allowed to marry your breastfeeding daughter. Just as you are not allowed to marry your blood daughter, because of the hadith, whatever is haram from the birth relations is also haram through breastfeeding relations. So just understand the difference here, that's vital. Likewise, if a woman breastfed you and she has a husband, and this husband of hers had been married to another woman in the past whom he has divorced, you are allowed to marry that woman. And also, fourthly, if you have a breastfeeding son and this breastfeeding son married a woman and then divorced her, you would be allowed to marry that particular woman whom your breastfeeding son divorced. All of this would be haram with the blood relation, but halal through the breastfeeding relation. But if we go along with this opinion, then it may well be possible to combine between a woman and her breastfeeding daughter, or a woman and her breastfeeding mother. And so how can you combine between two people who are closely related in this affair? Surely you cannot combine between a woman and her biological mother. Likewise, a woman and her biological daughter, you cannot combine between them in marriage. Yet, are you now saying that you're allowed to combine between a woman and her breastfeeding daughter, or between a woman and a breastfeeding mother? Well, the answer would be that the reason why this is haram is because it would lead to breaking up ties of kinship. But the relationship of the rada'a, breastfeeding relation, does not have ties of kinship that need to be respected and catered for. So therefore there's no problem in this. So that's the theory behind this dispute. Let us be practical and we'll say this, that there is no shortage of women in this world. If anything, it's the other way around. So when it's established that there is no shortage of women in this world, one should not opt to marrying the breastfeeding mother of one's wife, or the breastfeeding daughter of one's wife, or the woman whom his breastfeeding father has been previously married to but is now divorced from, or the divorced wife of his breastfeeding son. One should not marry these four types of women, except in a case of necessity, and this would be a dire necessity. It's really difficult to envisage such a situation nowadays, especially when there are more women than men. But we say, for practical purposes, adopt the opinion of the majority who simply say, no, it's all haram. This is a more practical approach.
Just to pick up on a few more points of benefit, with regards to the hadith about the Prophet wanting to curse this man who wanted to have intercourse with the pregnant, captive woman. Now the child, of course, belongs to the previous owner of the woman, not to the current owner about which the hadith was revealed. And so if that's the case, the current owner could use this child as a servant, as the child would not be the biological child of this man in the narration. But Al-Qurtubi says that the Prophet says that he's not allowed to use this child as a khadim or as a servant, because if this man had intercourse with this captive woman, then it would be as if this man has a share in the fatherhood. So it's as if this child is his son, which would mean that you're not allowed to use your own son as a servant, of course. If you are free, then your son is also free, whether the son comes from a wife or a concubine. In any case, the practical ruling is that you're not allowed to have intercourse with a pregnant woman who is not your wife, because of the narration of the zara', or the planting your crops, which we quoted before, and also authentically in the Sunan, the Prophet saying about the captive women of Awtas, لا توطأ حامل حتى تضع ولا غير ذات حمل حتى تحيض حيضة. The pregnant woman must not be laid with until she delivers her load, nor the non-pregnant woman be laid with until she undergoes one menstrual cycle. And the reason for that is because then you know that she is not pregnant. Also, with the issue of al-ghila, we may take that it is absolutely fine to take knowledge and guidance from the kuffar, as long as it does not contradict the Quran and the Sunnah. And this can be done in all areas of life, be it scientific areas, social areas, and so on. Hikmah, as the scholars say, is the dhalla, the lost property of the mu'min. Wherever he finds it, he has most right to it.
Let's move to the next chapter in this book of Ar-Rada'ah, about your uncle from breastfeeding. Aisha reports that Aflah, the brother of Abul Qu'ais, sought permission to enter in my room. Abul Qu'ais was Aisha's uncle from breastfeeding, that is, the husband of Aisha's breastfeeding mother. She says, I refused to admit him. And then she informed the Prophet when he came, and the Prophet commanded her to give him permission the next time he asks. And in another narration, the Prophet said, فَإِنَّهُ عَمُّكْ تَرِبَتْ يَمِينُكْ. He is your paternal uncle. May your right hand become dusty. This is an expression of encouragement. So we find from these narrations that Aisha had a breastfeeding mother. Her mother had a husband called Abul Qu'ais, and Abul Qu'ais had a brother called Aflah. And it is this man, Aflah, who sought permission to enter upon Aisha. Aisha thought that Aflah is just an ajnabi, a foreign man to her, because he did not breastfeed me, she is thinking. But the Prophet told her, no, that these breastfeeding relations run further than you think. So the man who is married to the woman who is breastfeeding you is your breastfeeding father. This must be during the time when she is breastfeeding you. It mustn't be a man who was married to your breastfeeding mother but then divorced her and then thereafter this mother breastfed you. No, that does not apply. And likewise, after your breastfeeding mother has breastfed you and then thereafter another man comes and marries this breastfeeding mother of yours, then no, he is not your father. What we're talking about is the man who is married to the woman whilst she is breastfeeding you. He is the sahibul laban, the owner of the milk. And so he becomes your breastfeeding father. So his sister would be your paternal aunt, and hence haram for you to marry your paternal aunt, of course, through breastfeeding. Likewise, if this man has children from another woman, meaning another woman not the woman who is breastfeeding you, then his children would be your siblings. So they would be like your half-siblings from the father, your consanguine siblings. If your breastfeeding mother has any other children, either blood or through breastfeeding, then they will also be your siblings. So through the breastfeeding, you could have uterine siblings, you can also have consanguine siblings. By consanguine, we intend half-siblings from the father's side. We find in this a great virtue of Aisha radiallahu anha in that she is trying her best to observe the laws of the Sharia, and that when she is unsure of something, she will ask. And this is a lesson we can all take, to try to observe the laws of the Sharia as best as we can, even if we make a mistake from time to time, and also to ask about those affairs which are unclear to us. We can also take that a dua can be made, but its meaning not intended. The Prophet said, Taribat yaminuk, or Taribat yadak, may your hands become dusty. That is to say, you have no wealth, and that you only have dust in your hands. Now, nobody really intends this dua. Why would you want to make dua for poverty upon a person? But rather, this is just an expression in the form of a dua, which is used to urge someone to do something. So here the Prophet is encouraging Aisha to allow Aflah into her dwelling. And because the Prophet is encouraging her to let Aflah into the dwelling, we can take from it that it is not righteous for a woman to cover herself up in front of a maharim. If she's doing it as a matter of ibadah or drawing closer to Allah, then this is clearly opposing the text. If she is doing it because she's genuinely shy, then this is not the praiseworthy type of shyness. It could, however, be understandable that she wants to cover up in front of one of her mahram because one of the mahram male is of a perverted type of nature. And that would be understandable. Let us move to the next chapter, that the daughter of your breastfeeding brother is haram. Let's take this narration from Abdullah ibn Abbas. He said that we wanted the daughter of Hamza ibn Muttalib to be married to the Prophet, and the Prophet said, إِنَّهَا لَا تَحِلُّ لِي إِنَّهَا ابْنَةُ أَخِي مِنَ الرَّضَاعَةِ وَيَحْرُمُ مِنَ الرَّضَاعَةِ مَا يَحْرُمُ مِنَ الرَّحِمِ. she is not halal for me, she is the daughter of my breastfeeding brother. And whatever is haram from the womb relations, meaning the blood relation, is also haram with the breastfeeding relation. Okay, so what is the relation between the Prophet ﷺ and Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib radiallahu anhu? The relationship is that Hamza is the paternal uncle of the Prophet, the of the Prophet. And so his daughter would be the Prophet's cousin. And that marriage would normally be allowed. Only in this particular scenario, both the Prophet and Hamza were breastfed by the same woman, so they both have a same breastfeeding mother, which would therefore mean that Hamza's daughter is like the niece of the Prophet through breastfeeding relations. And we know you are not allowed to marry the niece, because that is clear cut in the Quran in Surah An-Nisa. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَبَنَاتُ الْأَخِي, and the daughters of your brother. Who was this woman who breastfed both of them? The woman's name is Thuwayba, the servant girl of Abu Lahab. And here it is worth pointing out a qaida or guiding principle about breastfeeding. If a child is breastfed by a woman, obviously therefore his breastfeeding mother, then this hurma, or if you like the relationship of mahramiyya, applies to the radi', who is the breastfeeding child, but it also applies to his children. So that is to say, we have a mahramiyya relationship between this child and the breastfeeding mother. So it's a mother-son relationship, through breastfeeding of course, not through blood. But if this child grows up to have children of his own or of her own, then these children are also maharim of the breastfeeding mother. They are like the breastfeeding mother's grandchildren, and the same thing with great-grandchildren, and so on, going down in that line. So the mahramiyya applies. But note that this mahramiyya does not apply between the child's biological father and the breastfeeding mother. So they are not maharim to each other. Notice this difference. Okay, what about the children of the breastfeeding mother? Well, all the children of the breastfeeding mother, whoever the father may be, all of these children are mahram to the breastfeeding child. So it matters not where her children come from. They may come from a previous husband whom she is now divorced from. Those children are maharim to this breastfeeding child. Or she may have children from her current husband. They are also maharim to the breastfeeding child. Or she may have children from a future husband. Those children will also be maharim to this breastfeeding child. And the third person in this equation is the husband of the breastfeeding mother. What about his children? The husband of the breastfeeding mother, his children are also maharim to the breastfeeding child. Remember, this husband is the breastfeeding father of this child. And again, it makes no difference as to where his children come from. So he may have children from a previous wife. Those children are maharim to the breastfeeding child. He may have children from this current wife who is breastfeeding the child. And again, that's obvious. His children are maharim to this breastfeeding child. Or he may have children from a future wife, not to this current wife. And again, those children will also be maharim to the breastfeeding child. Just remember that this husband of the breastfeeding mother is seen as the father of the breastfeeding child. So any children which he has would have to be maharim of the breastfeeding child. So basically they would be his siblings through a breastfeeding relationship, not through a blood relationship. So these are some qawa'id or some guiding principles worthy to be remembered. Let's move to the next chapter about the prohibition of marrying a stepdaughter and the sister of your wife. Habiba, one of the wives of the Prophet radiallahu anha, reports that she said to the Prophet, "Do you have any inclination towards my sister, the daughter of Abu Sufyan?" The Prophet said, "What should I do?" She said, "You should marry her." And the Prophet said, "You want that to happen?" And she replied by saying that, "I am not exclusively your wife," meaning to say there are many other co-wives. And the most beloved person I would want to share as being a co-wife would be my sister. And the Prophet replied, فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَحِلُّ لِي, she is not halal for me. Then Habiba said, "I have been informed that you have proposed to marry Durra, the daughter of Abu Salama." The Prophet said, Bint Salama, the daughter of Salama? She says, I said yes. And the Prophet replied, لو أنها لم تكن ربيبتي في حجري ما حلت لي إنها ابنة أخي من الرضاعة أرضعتني وأباها ثويبة فلا تعرضن علي بناتكن ولا أخواتكن. The Prophet said, even if she was not my Rabiba, that is, the daughter of my wife, she would still not be halal for me. She is the daughter of my brother from breastfeeding. Thuwayba breastfed both me and her father. So do not give me the proposal of the marriage of your daughters and sisters. Here in this narration, Habiba wants the Prophet to marry her sister, because if she is going to have co-wives, then why not her sister to share with her in this goodness of being the Prophet's wife? And the Prophet simply says, فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَحِلُّ لِي, she is not halal for me. Because we know the Quran forbids joining sisters in marriage. وَأَن تَجْمَعُوا بَيْنَ الْأُخْتَيْنِ إِلَّا مَا قَدْ سَلَفَ, and that you should combine between two sisters in marriage except that which has already passed. So that was a straightforward case of it being haram, because you're not allowed to join between two sisters in marriage. These are definitely two blood-related sisters, because co-wives can compete with each other and may hate each other. Now, if these two co-wives are related through blood, then it is, of course, obligatory to uphold ties of kinship. But two co-wives, if they hate each other or have enmity with each other, it's likely to break ties of kinship. So this is one of the reasons why you are not allowed to combine between two near relatives in marriage, like two sisters, or a woman and her maternal or paternal aunt, or a woman and her mother. But then she entertains this idea of the daughter of Abu Salama. Abu Salama died, and the Prophet married his widow, who is Salama, and the Durra, who was the daughter of Salama and Abu Salama, was the Rabiba of the Prophet. Rabiba means the daughter of your wife. Of course, that's not your daughter biologically, but it's your daughter from your wife from another man. And the Quran clearly forbids this. وَرَبَائِبِكُمُ اللَّاتِي فِي حُجُورِكُمْ, and your raba'ib in your dwelling places. But the Prophet said, even if she was not the Rabiba, she would still be haram. Why is this? He says, she is the daughter of my brother through breastfeeding. In other words, Abu Salama and the Prophet, they are both brothers through breastfeeding relation. He said, أَرْضَعَتْنِي وَأَبَاهَا ثُوَيْبَةً, that a woman called Thuwayba breastfed both me and her father, Abu Salama. So that would make Durra, the daughter of Abu Salama, the Prophet's niece through breastfeeding relations. And we know you're not allowed to marry your niece, just like we found out in the previous chapter, you're not allowed to marry your niece through breastfeeding. The Quran says, وَبَنَاتُ الْأَخِي, and the daughters of your brother. So that is your blood brother and also your breastfeeding brother. You're not allowed to marry their daughters. Let's give the general rules of the mahramiyah created by the sihr, by the marriage relations. We'll take the focal point to be the man. So which women are haram for the man? Well, first of all, the wife's mother is haram for the man. So as soon as he enters into a marriage contract with a woman, just by merely the marriage contract alone, his wife's mother becomes haram for him forever. So she becomes a mahram for him. So she does not need to observe hijab in front of him forever. They can be in privacy forever, even if he divorces his wife. Okay, the second one, what about the wife's daughter? Yes, the wife's daughter, who is obviously not from him, becomes a mahram to the man if he consummates marriage with his wife. Notice the difference here. The mahramiyah is not created merely through the contract. Rather, the marriage needs to be consummated. How do we know this? This is clear in the Quran. مِن نِسَائِكُمُ اللَّاتِي دَخَلْتُمْ بِهِنْ, from your wives whom you have entered upon, meaning have had conjugal relations with. So it is not enough that he should just be in privacy with his wife. No, he has to actually consummate the marriage. Then the wife's daughter would become haram for him forever. So if he divorces this wife of his before consummating marriage, then he is allowed to marry his wife's daughter. And then we have the father's wife, and she becomes a mahram forever merely through the contract. So no need to consummate the marriage. And then fourthly and finally we have the son's daughter. Note that this is your biological son. According to the majority, like we spoke before, it can also be your breastfeeding son. But anyway, your son's daughter is haram for you to marry forever. She is your mahram, so she does not need to observe hijab in front of you. You can be in privacy together. And again, this mahramiyah is created merely through the aqd, through the contract. So you just have to note the one exception, which is your wife's daughter. That mahramiyah is created not merely through the contract, the other three are. So that mahramiyah is created through consummating the marriage. Note that. The ayah of the Quran, which speaks about your rabiba, says that she must be in your hujur, in your dwelling quarters. But what if you have a rabiba who does not live with you? Does that make a difference? The answer is no, it does not make a difference in the ruling. And the reason why the ayah points out that she's in your dwelling place is because this is what is most commonly the case. That's all. It does not have an effect on the ruling. What does have an effect on the ruling is whether you've consummated the marriage or not. That's why Allah Jalla wa Ala goes on to say, فَإِن لَمْ تَكُونُوا دَخَلْتُمْ بِهِنَّ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ. But if you have not consummated marriage with them, then there is no sin upon you. Notice that Allah keeps quiet about whether she lives in your dwelling quarters or not. Why? Because that does not make a difference to the ruling.
Because if it did, then Allah Jalla wa Ala would have spoken about it, just like He spoke about the consummation of the marriage. Okay, at this point, let us take some review questions. So, question number 1. Explain what we mean by al-azl and explain its ruling. Question number 2. Explain what we mean by al-ghila and explain its ruling. Question number 3. Explain in what way the mahramiyah spreads. So in other words, if you are a breastfeeding father and you have a breastfeeding child, which relatives of the child will also be mahram to you? And then explain which relatives of the child will not be a mahram to you.